Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I speak with Marguerite Rigoglioso, author of The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births. We discuss the Immaculate Conception of Mary and the possibility that Mary was part of a tradition of Hebrew priestesses extending back to the matriarch Sara, and how stories of miraculous births are foundational to the Hebrew tradition. Marguerite also discusses the value of exploring non-canonical texts and how her work restores agency to the figure of Mary.
Dr. Marguerite Mary Rigoglioso is the foremost authority on the history of virgin birth and has taught graduate and undergraduate courses in both the United States and the United Kingdom. She is the director of her own esoteric school, Seven Sisters Mystery School, dedicated to restoring knowledge about the sacred feminine and to empowering people on their non-traditional spiritual journeys. Her research on female deities and women's religious leadership in the ancient Mediterranean world and beyond has appeared in anthologies and journals, including Feminist Theology, the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, Societies of Peace, She is Everywhere, Trivia, and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, where her paper on the cult of Demeter and Persephone in Sicily received an honorable mention for the New Scholar Award. She is the author of The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece and Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity. And her most recent book is The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births, which is the topic of our conversation today. Marguerite, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate the invitation to be here.
Well, I'm very happy that you accepted it, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So first, I wanted to congratulate you on your recent book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births. I found it to be a very fascinating book, and you touched on a few topics that have puzzled me for a while. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. I thought that there were probably several places where we could begin exploring your work, but I thought that maybe the best place to begin would be with the idea of the Immaculate Conception. Yeah. I think a lot of people may believe this just refers to the virgin birth of Jesus, but that's not true, is it? It also refers to Mary as having had a miraculous birth.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception is technically about Mary's conception by her mother Anne. Like you're saying, it's not Mary's conception of Jesus. The Immaculate Conception is Mary's being conceived into her mother's body. That's the technical, religious, Christian wording for it. Okay, so typically though, people use Immaculate Conception to refer to Mary's conception of Jesus, but it isn't that, technically speaking.
I think that one of the things I want to sort of get out of the way at the very beginning is this whole idea of Parthenogenesis. That's asexual reproduction. Yeah. And this is something that is well documented in several species, right? And I think that you're making the case that it is also something that is possible in mammals and humans. And I just wanted to know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. In my first book, The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece that you mentioned earlier, I have a whole chapter at the end that says, is parthenogenesis possible, or is divine birth possible? And I talk about various species that can reproduce asexually, especially under captivity. So every once in a while, people will send me over the years, people have sent me an article, oh, a shark, gave divine birth or virgin birth under captivity, a snake, a Komodo dragon, this, that. So it is possible, even in animals that are normally considered to need the male and the female to come together. There has also been, there are certain actual species that do this on their own. They're kind of rare and few and far between. But then scientifically, females of various species have been induced parthenogenetically, or in other words, virgin birth without a male sperm, like sea urchins. I think there might have been experiments on rabbits and different other things. And then there was experimentation into mice. Mice eggs were induced to start dividing and create zygotes using chemical means. Usually it's electric shock or chemical means that can start this. And in one of the experiments, Jerry Hall, who's this fertility researcher in the LA area, was able to get these zygotes back into the mice mothers and have them start taking root and growing in the mice. And then at that point, and this must have been a couple of decades ago, the National Institutes of Health shut down the experiment because it started breaching supposedly medical ethics. So then there's the whole phenomenon of cloning. And there are many underground claims that there is human cloning going on in various countries, under covert cover. And then if you get really deep and dark, it's said that this is actually regularly being used by governments of various countries, to produce these types of people, let's say. Those types of claims cannot be verified or have not been verified in the mainstream. But let's just say that cloning would be on par with all of this type of research. And that would be, really, when you think about it, in vitro fertilization it's not so much parthenogenesis, but it's definitely noodling around with the human egg, right? And there have been experiments, they're always experimenting with eggs and sperm, right? To kind of see what they can do, human eggs and sperm. And so if you were to search around, you would be able to find these types of experiments going on. That I also, shockingly, when I was doing this research, back in the early 2000s, I saw an artificial womb that was being created with a four-legged animal. And I don't know if it was goats or whatever, but I still have these files. I mean, I printed stuff like this out, and it sort of shocked me that they somewhere had gotten to the level of being able to create artificial wombs. So there's just a lot going on in terms of the medical exploration, the inducement of it. But of course, when I'm talking about divine birth, I'm talking about a high level spiritual practice of holy women that would go far beyond anything that could be medically induced in a lab, where you're missing the ingredients of consciousness of the priestess to bring in a certain consciousness into her body.
Thank you for that. In your book, you rely very heavily on an apocryphal text. I think the official name is the Proto-Evangelium of James, although, and it's also known as the Infancy Gospel of James, though you write that the traditional and more accurate title would be Birth of Mary, Revelation of James. Yes. Which makes a lot of sense since the entire text is focused on Mary. And It's only the last few lines that introduce the identity of the author as James. So it's beyond me. Well, I do kind of understand why they would focus on James rather than Mary, patriarchy, right? But I had a couple of questions about this. One, I very much appreciate the fact that you are relying on an apocryphal text. And I wanted to ask you, I imagine that most people listening understand what an apocryphal text is, but I was hoping that you could give a very short explanation of what an apocryphal text is.
Right.
Start there.
These are the texts that the Roman Catholic Church rejected in its decisions in like the 4th and 5th century, maybe 6th century. There were various councils and decrees. The Gelasian decree, or sometimes called the Gelasian decree, made a list of texts of the day and which ones were going to be considered official, part of the Bible, and which were going to be thrown aside. And the infancy gospel of James was thrown aside. And you could find commentary from various popes and things like that who said, oh, it's full of absurdities and this, that, and the other thing. So it joins the grouping of texts that were not accepted in the official Christian Bible.
Thank you for that. And just personally speaking, it's one of my soapboxes that I like to get on, especially when I'm teaching, is that if we really want to understand early Christianity, we have to look at these texts because they give us so much information. And even if they were considered not official texts or what's the word I'm looking for? Revelatory text. That's not quite the term I'm looking for, I don't think. They were still influential. As you said, this informed the Feast of Mary holiday. And was it, I think that there were other texts that it influenced as well. There's more than just this one apocryphal text that discusses Mary. Is that correct?
Yes. There are, as it turns out, biographies about her. There's one that is attributed to the so-called Maximus the Confessor, the life of the Virgin, right? There are various biographies that seem to rely in part on this text, but they also seem to rely on other texts that may have been lost. So when you kind of start doing this exploration into what's been said about Mary, this is the territory that you get into. And therefore, it's particularly shocking to know that she's barely mentioned in what is now the Christian Bible. She's relegated to maybe 2 of the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and hardly anything is said about her. We have to go to these other texts to know what was being said at the time or, in the couple of hundred years after her life about her. And right. Okay. And this is, this is not to mention the Gnostics, the so-called Gnostic Gospels and texts, which interestingly do not mention the Virgin Mary directly. We do have a Gospel of Mary, but it seems to be about Mary Magdalene. And we have other mentions of Mary Magdalene and just a couple of little mentions of Mother Mary, like in the Gospel of Philip and some, like she was one of the 3 Marys who walked with Jesus, etc. So this is like you're saying, it's this whole world and it's this whole milieu of additional texts from which we get a lot of information. And to my mind, like the real juicy, important stuff lies in these Gnostic, so-called Gnostic texts, and these apocryphal Gospels, which are a whole separate category. And these other biographies, which I don't know if they're considered apocryphal. Probably that term would be used, but that's getting into like the finer points of
Right.
the academic theological
Right.
world, right?
No, I just appreciated very much that you were bringing in these apocryphal texts because, like I said, I think that is so necessary to do, and it just opens up the exploration of this period of time.
Yeah. It's
So
where the real information is,
yeah,
because it's clear that what is in the canonical gospel was edited
Mhm.
and sanitized according to what was going to work for the by then established Roman Catholic Church
right.
at the time of 600 AD.
Mhm. What is the dating of the Birth of Mary text?
Okay, well, academically speaking, it could be dated as early as 150 AD of the Common Era. Some people date it later than that, but it could be right around that, which is technically older than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. However, in the text itself, it said this author says that he is writing at the time of Herod and all of these various things that were going on. And if that is true, then he was an eyewitness to a lot of what happened in this text, which is basically what was going on around the conception and the fleeing of Mary and Joseph and the birth of Mary in the cave and the birth of Jesus in the cave and so forth. So it could be dated to 4 BC, which is basically considered to be the time of Jesus, which is strange because we think, no, 0 BC
right.
would, but no, it apparently 4 BC is the time more or less that Jesus was born, right?
Right.
So it could be as old as that. Now there are all these arguments that come in that, they start sifting through this and that and saying, well, it couldn't be that because of this, that, and the other thing. Ronald Hawk, in his book, The Infancy Gospel of James and Thomas, I think, goes through some of that. But when I read it, Nick, I was like, I'm not that worried about any of these arguments. I'm not that convinced. I don't think these are big problems. And therefore, I think that it could be an authentic text written at the time that it was said it was written.
Mm-hmm. My understanding is you're not alone in that. I think the consensus is that it dates from sometime around the 2nd century, but I do know that there is some disagreement in that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
Definitely a possibility. So I was wondering then, since we're talking about this, could you give a brief overview of this text of Mary, the infancy gospel of Mary, for listeners who are not familiar with it?
Right. So what this does is it opens talking about a character that we really don't know, 2 characters that we really don't know from traditional Christianity, according to the canonical Bible, namely Anna, or originally named Hannah, and her husband or consort, Joachim. And it talks about the travails they've been going through with her not getting pregnant. And it leads into the actual pregnancy of Mary by Anne through miraculous means. It leads us through Mary's infancy. And then it leads us through her toddlerhood. Then it leads us to how she is given over to the temple, the Hebrew temple, at age 3, tells us a little bit about what happened when she was raised in that temple. And then it talks about how she kind of gets ejected from the temple, supposedly, at least by this later, probably redacted version, this edited version, talks to us about, we're hearing little children.
Yes.
Then it picks up where she's given over from the temple because she is now 12 years old, presumably menstruating and considered, quote, unclean. And by divination, she's given over to this elder widow named Joseph to be kind of caretaken. This is the period when she becomes pregnant. We hear all about that and why and how it emerges out of a ritual that she was invited to participate in. And then it talks to us about travails she had while she was pregnant, after she gave birth. And it finally concludes with, she and Joseph and Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, and her consort, Zechariah, being under pursuit, by the Roman Empire, because the Caesar at the time, Herod, it's Herod, who is very nervous about the idea that these are divinely born children. He gets wind of it from soothsayers. And it ends with the murder of Elizabeth's consort, Zechariah, for not revealing the whereabouts of her son, John. This is a backstory that we don't hear about in the Bible, and it's been criticized as being made up backstory. But the fact is that it's so compelling and mystical, and the details in it correspond so beautifully with all of the research that I did about divine birth, the signs and the symbols, that I found it to be incredibly authentic because of those correspondences. And nobody but a seriously mystical writer who was privy to women's mysteries and details thereof could have written this. It does seem to me a very, very authentic document.
One of the things that really interested me is this claim that Mary is part of a lineage of divine births. And you take this all the way back to the matriarch Sara. And I think that most people know the story of how Sara, who the Bible tells us was 90 years old and no longer with the manner of women, is what it says. That's when she conceived her son, Isaac. But yet she's not the only woman to experience a sort of miraculous birth in the book of Genesis, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Rachel. And even beyond this, sticking with the sort of biblical and extra biblical text, you mentioned the Gnostics. I know there are some Gnostic texts of Pistis Sophia giving birth on her own. And, this idea of miraculous birth seems to be fundamental to the biblical tradition.
Yeah. Hello. Right? Hello. I mean, it was not made up or begun with Mary. This goes back to Hebrew women, from a dating that we can't even pin down. When did Sarah and Abraham live? And there is the ancient Jewish writer. It's not Josephus. It's the other one. And his name's going to come to me. I don't know why I always blank out on his name. But he writes all about the Essenes, and he writes about basically that these women, all of whom you mentioned, and he adds Zipporah, the wife of Moses, as being essentially virgin birth priestesses, essentially. Okay. And it's truly astounding, and if I had really wanted to, I could have gone into Rachel and Leah. I didn't, I just stuck kind of with Sarah. But that would be something for another scholar to really look at and make some correspondences. Who were these women? So this is firmly in the Hebrew tradition. And what I say is it's not just about these poor, hapless, barren women who are old now.
Right.
It's something else It's about women who were trying their whole lives to have a divine conception. And because of how they worked with their bodies, they were able to do it into what we consider older age, or even like a post-menopausal type of age. And it was a practice, you know, and I talk extensively in the book, as you saw, about Sara. And I really build on the work of Savina Tuval in her book, Sara, the Priestess. It's an excellent book, and she gets this close to saying and showing that Sara was a divine birth priestess. And I take it the rest of the way. Tuval is no longer with us. She's passed to the realm of the ancestors. So I couldn't have our conversation with her about that. But it's truly stunning who she reveals Sara was. And, you know, she was just no ordinary woman. I mean, she was truly a high priestess. So this is telling us that there was a practice that was going on that these women knew how to do, and they knew how to pass it on. And what we see in the birth of Mary gospel that we're talking about now, the infancy gospel of James, is that Anne refers back to Sara when she goes into her altered state conception experience. And we also hear in there that she brings in these virgins of the temple to condition Mary, even when she's an infant and a toddler in Anne's, growing up in Anne's sacred bedroom. So there is a tradition of virgins who are all a part of this. These are priestesshoods, right? Virgins who know what they're doing. And then these are probably the same virgins that continue to teach and raise Mary to be a divine birth priestess from the time she's 3 until about the time she's 12 in the temple. And then, as though that's not enough, what we hear is that Elizabeth, who we know from the canonical gospel is a relative of Mary, she's supposedly a cousin. But what I find in the Islamic tradition, lo and behold, the Quran says that actually Elizabeth was Anne's sister. This blew my mind. Yeah. Elizabeth, who becomes virgin birth pregnant with John the Baptist, is Anne's sister. So this is talking about family lines of this, right? And it seems that Elizabeth, through these various things that I suss out in this gospel, Elizabeth conceived in this John in the same ritual that Mary conceived Jesus. There were 8 women working together, almost like a spinning wheel.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that spinning wheel and this idea of weaving is a theme that you pick up in the book as well.
It's huge. I mean, the veil for what's going on with this virgin birth conception technology is literally the veil of the temple. Okay. So they veil this, like I wish I had thought of this when I was writing the book. James, the author, veils what's going on by literally describing the veil of the temple and saying that's what these women were doing. They were weaving the temple veil, which in and of itself was a whole huge remarkable thing that I discuss in detail in this book. It was this huge endeavor. The temple veil, it would be the veil that would divide the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. It would be thick like this, huge. It took literally more than 100 people to carry it. You can imagine. And it would always have the signs of the universe on it, the astrological signs. I mean, it was like an amazing thing. So this is the veil or the overlay that we are being told to conceal the details of the actual conception ritual by the author, saying that these 8 women were weaving the temple veil. And we know that it took way more than 8 women to weave these veils. I mean, there were personnel that lived in the temple, virgins, who would do this literally probably hundreds of them. Okay. So to say that it was 8 is like our clue that it's not just the weaving of the temple veil that's happening here. It's the weaving of something else, which is DNA. And so through a very intricate ritual, and I'm able to tease out all of these other hints that James gives us because I'm able to cross-reference it with all of the research that I did in ancient Greece to show, wow, weaving means this. This symbol means that. The women at the well means that. The women using the vessel means that, right? Okay. Kind of piecing out what actually happened, what Mary and the others actually did so that she could conceive Jesus in her womb, and then Elizabeth could conceive John in her womb.
I have several threads I want to pull here, if you will. But one, I think the immediate thought that comes to mind is this connection with Mary and the veil and weaving the veil. And it seems to me that gives a very different, or can give a very different reading to, I think it's the Gospel of John. When Jesus is crucified, we're told that the veil tears down the middle.
Wow. I just have to sit with that for a minute, because yes, you're right. And I just want to tune in here for a second on that one. Yeah. I mean, that reference, people know how tremendous that reference is, who are tuned into the idea that Jesus was a very high level being who walked the planet, and that Mary was a high level being who walked the planet, and the whole Holy Family was. So the tearing of the veil is really like the ripping of the time-space continuum and the alteration of a timeline that should have gone a different way, but ended up going the way of the adversaries and the archons, okay, who really grabbed what was going on with Jesus and turned it into a tragedy that they had to make lemonade out of. They're like, all right, well, we're going to have to do ascension through the tragedy way now. We had really come to do it a different way. But that rending of the veil does refer back to the womb. And it refers back to like the disruption of the women's plan. And it's almost equivalent of like the nuclear bomb splitting the atom. You know what I mean? Like it's that level of esoteric shenanigans that is being this travesty that's being described. And the interesting thing about it is that the late Hindu saint Sri Kaleshwar, who brought forth a lot of esoteric information about Mary and Jesus, the divine conception, as well as what happened at the crucifixion, both by accessing the ancient palm leaf manuscripts, literally writings made by ancient sages on palm leaves, as well as his own past life recall. He said that Mary resurrected Jesus through her womb, through a very high level yoga. They were doing several yogas together to make this thing happen. Okay, they were such high advanced people that they could do this. But it is referring to the womb. That tearing of the veil is referring to the womb. But, you know, according to Kaleshwar, all was not lost. Everything was resurrected, you know, through this womb. The womb gave birth to Jesus and took him back and resurrected him on whatever level he was resurrected, whether it's off planet or whether Sri Kaleshwar said that he had a timeline in India. So, yeah, I think that's profound, Nick, and thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, of course. And, you know, just the the way that you describe the veil, what's on it is this depiction of the universe of sorts. And so it's what you were just saying, is that tearing of the veil in a very, just the symbolism of it is the tearing of the universe.
Yeah, the tearing of the universe, which is what the nuclear bomb does.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it creates portals through which negative beings can come in to various realities, which is what has happened on the planet.
That was just my geekiness. That was David Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return. That's what he had in there.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah, it was the atomic blast tore open these portals, which allowed these sort of demonic beings of sorts to come into the world and create more suffering.
Well, that's disclosure, basically. Yeah. That's disclosure right there, which a lot of films and filmmakers do, because it rips the time-space continuum, which is a travesty. It's something that should not be done.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is going to bring me in a weird way to my next question. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to refer to this this third season of Twin Peaks, because the episode that shows this, it's episode 8, and he shot it in black and white, and it's just phenomenal. And there's this scene towards the end where you see this figure kind of coming down out of the sky, and he goes into a radio station and he takes over the airwaves, and he is just repeating this phrase over and over and over. And the beginning of this almost poem that he keeps reciting is, "This is the water, this is the well, descend and drink deep." And so that I think leads into this other question. And it's something that I wanted to ask you about, because it has always puzzled me that in the biblical text, there is this theme that's repeated of figures being at a well. So we have Isaac meets Rebecca by the spring of water. He's at the well. Jacob meets Rachel by the well. When Moses flees to Midian after having killed the Egyptian, he's found by the priest of Midian and the priest's 7 daughters while he's sitting by a well. And I believe in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, Demeter also stops by a well. And I think that in the myth of Isis, at least the one told by Plutarch, she also is, a well features deep. Now, I always read this as water being a source of life, or an archetypal font of spirit, if you will. But I was wondering if you could explore how you're reading the symbolism of being at the well.
Yes, and I talk about that extensively in one of the parts of the book, because several of the things that you mentioned all have to do with women who give divine birth. So the Rachel, the Isaac and Rachel story, and then the Demeter and Persephone. Demeter stops at a well, and who does she encounter? The Daughters of Metinera. And in my book, Virgin Mother Goddesses of Antiquity, I talk extensively about these Daughters of Metinera as being divine birth priestesses who were intimately associated with the original Eleusinian Mysteries ritual, which had a strong divine birth component, an actual ritual act that took place between, that was a parthenogenetic conception, right, by the high priestess. And so what you find in the infancy gospel of James, or the birth of Mary, not only is Mary weaving at the time of the conception of Jesus, and it describes, that she's spinning, now she's pulling back and forth, it's like these are all metaphors for the technology that she's using and her own altered inner state. But then we find that she's at a well in the middle of this ritual. She goes to the well. It's either the lather of the actual temple, the Hebrew temple. One of the scholars thinks that Mary was not in Joseph's house when this happened. Originally, before this was edited, she was at the temple doing this ritual, and it would be at the lather or the well that the voice of the angel comes to her to guide her in this ritual and tell her, yes, you're doing it right, you're going to be conceiving, da da da. And so I talk about the well as basically the symbol of the women's womb. Okay, it's the earth womb, it's the font of life, the source of life as a womb. And therefore, it is the place where womb-like things happen, like conceptions and so forth. And who knows who those 7 daughters are of the particular if we went into that, we'd probably find something about them, right? Yeah. And so Mary is drinking from the well. She's carrying the vessel. So I talk about how the vessel is a representation of her womb. So all of these things are just more fodder for helping us understand that this is a divine conception ritual in the womb.
I think that I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit in terms of still in the history, because in the infancy gospel, Mary is living in the temple. And you make the claim that, there is this priestesshood in the temple, but there's a lot of evidence that supports that, historically speaking. And I was just wondering if maybe you could address that a little bit, because, and I hope it isn't getting us too far away from anything, but there was this tradition in the ancient world of a priestesshood of sacred sexuality. And I've seen different variations of the word. I knew it as kadishtu, which is usually translated as temple prostitute.
Yeah.
But there was also a sacred marriage rite. And I know that you bring this up in the book. So I was just wondering if you could go into this a little bit, and how it applies. Yeah.
I think it's not beside the point at all. In fact, it is the very point that we really need to look at in order to validate the idea that Mary was associated with the temple. She was a virgin there, that there were other virgins there, that there was a whole bunch of stuff that these women were doing, etc. And it's something that often gets dismissed by, theologians in the Hebrew tradition or whatever. But when you dig into it, you find out in the very Genesis, it's talking about these temple virgins. Half the time they were weavers who were virgins. And then in some of the material in the Hebrew Bible, not just Genesis, but, well beyond in the other books, Kings, I'm not exactly remembering, they were considered part of the class of these women who would engage in sacred sexual relations. So they were both weavers and sex worker priestesses. And this is right in the Hebrew temple, let alone there seems to be some evidence of this going on in the ancient Greek world as well, which of course scholars, I've just seen it go on for years. They just completely shut it down and they dismiss it. And it's totally frustrating, to hear this kind of automatic response to this idea. But yes, something was going on. And we also know that there are numbers of references in the Hebrew Bible to the Kadeshu, that these women were basically sacred sex workers, and this was being decried by commentary, people giving commentary within some of these these books of the Bible saying, well, this is going on, it shouldn't be going on. You don't want your daughters to be like these Kadesh to, blah, 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 blah. So I write all about that in the book if people want to tease out and detail it. But yeah, there was stuff going on in the Hebrew temples, and this was the very type of thing that then, these leaders would come in and smash, the idols, smash, the temple, carry these women out and rape them, whatever, right? We can see even within the Bible itself, the transition being described. In doing so, the Bible is admitting that this stuff went on. Mm-hmm. So it is really all right there.
I don't see it as being too horribly controversial. The way that I typically teach the Hebrew Bible is that, it's showing this tension in a way between polytheism and monotheism. Right. And the Israelites, we know the Israelites were Canaanite. We know that the Israelites were Canaanite. They shared a culture. They shared a root language. They even shared DNA. And you make a connection with Anat, who is the Canaanite goddess. Yeah. And as you mentioned, the biblical text does show a lot of this, like 2 Kings, that's Josiah's reform, right, where they allegedly discover the book of Deuteronomy, and that's when they cleanse the temple. And it specifically says that the temple prostitutes were forcibly removed, as were the images of the goddess of
That's
Asherah.
Right. You see, it's more than just a clash of polytheism and monotheism. Mm-hmm. It's a clash of female goddess veneration and priestesshood and male God worship and takeover by the male clergy.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that the archaeology and a lot of the recent work really supports that.
Blessed be.
The more and more, I think much of the Hebrew Bible, especially the Deuteronomic history, is seen as being just polemical. And it is an attempt to centralize power and take control.
That's right. It is polemical. It's not really a religious spiritual document. It's kind of more a controlled history. Mm-hmm. Of what these later clergy wanted people to believe and think.
Right.
About their history and about reality itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was never, I don't think that it was very successful. I know that Ezekiel, who's writing at the time of the Babylonian invasion into Jerusalem, he mentions the women weeping for Tammuz in the temple. And Tammuz was the consort to Ishtar.
That's right.
And it always puzzled me. And this is one of the other reasons why I enjoyed reading your book, is what we are often told was that after the return from the exile in Babylon, Judaism at that point was radically monotheistic. And it always puzzled me as to how that could have happened. And I was always thinking, I don't think that it went away. I don't think the goddess went away. I don't think the polytheism went away.
No.
And I've often thought about Christianity as being how that manifested.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think Judaism stayed polytheistic and goddess worshiping for quite some time. It was neck and neck, right, with all of that programming that was going on for focusing on one male jealous god and a male clergy, whereas there was a priestesshood and goddess worship going on at the same time. And then somebody like Bernadette Bruton shows that some of these priestesses may have been leading the temples themselves in that early period itself. So, all these things get rewritten, and it's just so maddening. But these little shards of what it was poke through, and you can tune into it, which is what we're doing here, which is what you've been doing, and what in the kind of analysis that you're talking about.
One of the things that I also wanted to bring up is that I think that you're doing something very important with this, in the sense that I think that there has always been this very patriarchal attitude with Mary's conception of Jesus. And, in the biblical text, she's this passive vessel, and the emphasis is on virginity. And I think that this has been used negatively to suppress women's sexuality. And I found it so fascinating that I think that you were able to give Mary her agency back.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. And that's really important at this time in Earth history and in this day and age, because her virginity was an integral part. It was a necessary component to accomplish the technology of divine birth in the way that she wanted to and needed to, which was at a very high level. But that virginity aspect then came to be used to be applied as the measure for all women, that all women needed to be virgins. And they don't. They only need to be virgins if they are in their method of dedication in the priestesshoods, and specifically if they are supporting or attempting to do divine birth. Virginity is a necessary biophysical spiritual condition for it, because the womb is free of any other energy or karma that comes in when a human male comes into the womb. So a free and sovereign womb of a very, very high holy woman who is already an incarnate of the divine by virtue of her divine birth from her mother, she can really go to town then with bringing in this very high holy being. So it's like this was a familial plan, to adjust things so that Jesus could actually come in through a human conception. So virginity is not something that is meant to control women, and it is not an attribute that means that Mary was devoid of erotic power. On the contrary, all of her erotic power was generated from within and toward the within, so that she could conceive the way the goddess of the universe makes everything. She becomes one with the goddess of the universe, with Mother Divine, right? And so, I'm beginning in this book to elevate Mary to her true stature as the highest advanced human holy woman who ever walked on the planet, okay? And this puts her in a whole new light, and therefore it is able to put women in a whole new light. Because when we see what was possible for Mary, that she was not a passive victim or a let it be done according to thy will, kind of receptacle, when we restore her to the consciousness and power that she had, and the various other powers that she had, which is something I'm going to be writing about in my next book on Mary, this opens the door to possibilities of how human women can be on the planet themselves. We see Mary as a role model of far more than just being virginal, obedient, young, and passive. We come into the full flowering of what women can be, how they can be on the planet, how they can be bringing their tremendous womb powers to the healing and the rectification of this world.
It's very powerful. So thank you for that. And thank you for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
One of the questions I have in regards to all of this that just came to me as I was listening to you, you mentioned the Quran quite a bit in your book. And I don't know how many people are familiar with the fact that Mary appears in the Quran way more than she ever appears in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And this image that you are bringing forth of Mary, you know, on one hand, I want to ask, well, how is this going to affect, you know, Christianity and Judaism? But I'm also really interested on how this might shift attitudes in Islam.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Mary is mentioned a number of times in Islam. There is even something of a chapter of the Quran written about her, which is interesting because, and there is material written, not a ton, but written about her mother Anne, who never appears anywhere in the canonical Gospels of Christianity, and Joachim, her partner. So it's like the Muslims had the connection to these people. They understood who these people were. They were basing it on an older tradition that got erased in traditional Christianity, and they had no reason to erase this material. So there it all is. And so I want to like focus on the nut of your question. Maybe you can just rephrase it so that I can, because you were talking about the implications.
Well, yeah. Well, I was just thinking of, you know, Islam. You know, none of the traditions are especially great when it comes to women. You know, that's one of the things that almost all of the world's religious traditions get wrong is women. And what I'm finding is, you know, you are giving Mary her agency back. And I'm just curious how that might reverberate.
Right.
Within the other traditions, but I was also thinking in terms of Islam.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you know, what is said about her in Islam is not the analysis that I'm giving in the book.
Right,
you know what I mean? It's still a little bit,
yeah,
got her a little bit under veils and things. But I think that as this information seeps into the public consciousness, whatever religion you are or not, you know, agnostic, atheistic, it makes you take a second look at Mary, at the meaning of divine birth, the role of virginity, the history that surrounds Mary, the female personnel that might have been connected with her, and again, including her mother and her aunt, and the level of power of these women, something of which has been edited out, diminished, erased, distorted, twisted, you know. So I really think that the revelations of this book are potentially far reaching whenever it is that they come to capture the mass consciousness. Like right now, it's this information is, you know, and back in, you know, when 2008, when my dissertation came out, 2009 and 10, when my books came out about Greece, I already was starting to teach about Mary, and people, you know, in various seminars that I would do related to these books, And so the people who were flocking to it were really the high-level esoteric women and some men who considered themselves part of the global priestesshood. Now, over the years, then it's extended, to women and some men who do not necessarily consider them part of the global clergy or priestesshood or holy woman cadre, but they are finding great meaning in this. These are like a lot of the people who have been turned on to the whole new idea of Mary Magdalene that we can justify through looking at the shards in these books. So we're at the stage now with Mother Mary where we were with Mary Magdalene 10, 20, and 30 years ago when that material first started coming out. And that has started catching on like wildfire in a slow wildfire over 30 years. And now it's kind of much more common knowledge. And, Megan Watterson just had her book about Mary Magdalene Revealed, and right. So this is kind of more the beginning of the Mother Mary wildfire, so to speak. And we'll have to see where it goes. I trust in the divine timing of it, because sometimes when things are too much, too soon, they get the wrong kind of attention. And then you're dealing with all the people and the energies who don't want this information out there. Right now, it's still a little bit under the radar-y, as far as I can tell. And that's fine. It will have its own awakening with people in its own timing that will hopefully benefit everyone and humanity in a big way. And that could happen very quickly, or it could take a while. And it doesn't matter, in a way. I think it will also encourage people who left Christianity because they thought it had absurd claims and so forth and so on, to look back at it and say, well, gee, what is here for me? This sounds really esoteric and mystical. Maybe I should be looking at this in a new way. And that can lead them to the mystical Mary, the mystical Jesus, the Sacred Heart, the advent of the love energy on the planet, which is the only healing force, something that we need so deeply and desperately today, right? As we're going through this cataclysm of gargantuan global proportions.
Yes, agreed. And again, very beautifully stated. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I do have a couple of more questions for you.
Yes.
Maybe these are a little bit technical, but I'm curious, in your research, have you looked at any of the pseudepigraphic texts?
Yes. Various of them, not sure they're technically considered part of that category. I mean, would you consider the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs to be part of that? Are you familiar with that at all?
I'm not.
Okay, because there's material that I look at in the book from that.
Okay.
I don't think I went through the book of Enoch.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything in Enoch that would apply.
Yeah.
But I was just, I guess I was curious.
There's other the Midrash books and so forth and so on. There are other Hebrew books that I do have references to in here. And so whether it's part of this category that you're talking about or not, I'm just not sure, because that wasn't part of my study and expertise. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of those alternative or outside of the canon types of documents in the Hebrew tradition that are very interesting.
Yeah. So that's why I was just curious if you had looked, and if there was anything found there, because there's just so much there. But I think most of it is prophetic and probably apocalyptic. But I would imagine that there may be some information in terms of like Sophia and the Sophia tradition within that. So another question I had.
And incidentally, on this lines. The writer, the mystical Jewish writer I was talking about is Philo.
Oh,
He's the
yes.
one who talks about the founding mothers of the Hebrew tradition as essentially being virgin birth priestesses. And he's the one who talks a lot about the history of, he describes the Essenes, well, the Therapeutae in particular, and what they were all about. And so I discerned that, you know, Anne and her group may have been part of the Therapeutae, and many others have said that these people may have been part of the Essenes as well, largely speaking. And we don't know if, because somebody said to me, well, when you talk about Mary having gone into the temple, do you mean like the traditional Hebrew temple or the Essene temple? And I was like, well, I don't really know enough about it. And it would be fascinating to see if there is a body of history to suggest that there were Essene temples. I mean, I know that the Essenes worked largely kind of on their own in these little cells and these communities and so forth. So I don't know to what degree they had larger, more established types of things of the nature of like the traditional Hebrew temple.
Yeah, I don't know that they had a temple. Like you said, my understanding was always that they had removed themselves from Jerusalem, in large part because they were so sort of disgruntled with the management and activities in the temple.
Yeah, and they were more communal and just closer to the earth, and yeah, they weren't part of all that. So I don't know, but it was kind of an interesting question, don't you think? Like,
yeah, you know, where I would probably look would be I think there is a temple though in Elephantine.
Oh,
because one of the arguments is that it was at the time of the Babylonian conquest, you know, where the Jews were dispersed, you know, some of them, you know, the leaders were moved to Babylon, but many of them were dispersed, that a community ended up in Africa in Elephantine. And there's also a theory, I don't know how much merit there is to it, but there is a theory that the Elephantine temple is where the Ark of the Covenant is.
oh, wow.
So I know people have made, you know, I don't know the veracity of that.
Wow, that's fascinating.
But it could be, you know, looking at traditions and any writings at Elephantine you might be able to excavate some more information.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
tradition.
Wow, stuff like that. Yeah, that's so interesting to explore, because you can just uncover so much that's right there, but has not been given much attention.
Right.
You know, or even creeds. There's also the Mishnah Pesikta. What kind of a category would that come in? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Because I have several references to that.
I just know the Mishnah as the oral tradition.
Okay.
And that was eventually written down.
Yeah. So I have a few references to that. So it's like that extra biblical, you know, material.
Yeah. Well, and that's also worthy of looking at, you know, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the apocryphal text, the pseudepigraphic text.
Yeah.
You know, that's what makes all of this so absolutely fascinating. And I think open for exploration.
Yeah. And I mean, it's sort of amazing that more attention had not been given to the infancy gospel of James or birth of Mary, aside from these sort of dreary analyses that just it kind of recycle, you know, the same information. I think this is really the first one, to my knowledge, that really opens it up and says, oh my gosh, look at the universe within this.
Yeah.
And what it really is saying about Mary that we need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it addressed many of the things that I've always had questions about, like the well. And, I know we're out of time, but the other thing, and we didn't talk about this, but one of the questions I always had was, where is shamanism in the ancient tradition? Because it seemed like, everyone all around was engaged in shamanic activity, but yet it seems to be largely absent. And you address that in the book. So I appreciated that. I thought that it was just a phenomenal book and just opened up so many avenues. So let me ask you one final question.
Sure.
And that is, you said that you're working on a book. I wanted to know what's next for you. And then the final question is, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Oh, great. Yeah. So what's next? Well, while I was writing this book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, I realized that I was actually writing two books and they needed to be parthenogenetically divided because it was just going to be too much. And that this one needed to focus on the gospel, the birth of Mary, and the other needed to focus on these other biographies that I was discovering about Mary, plus what Sri Kaleshwar, whom I referenced earlier, was saying about her, which is tremendous. And, it just makes you weep. Plus my own engagements with Mother Mary and so forth. And so I will be completing that book shortly. And meanwhile, I've continued to offer courses and experiences with Mother Mary. For example, I have an online on-demand course called the Mother Mary Mystery Traditions, which basically consolidates a lot of the material from this book, plus the new book to come. And it also allows people to have a lived experience of Mother Mary through various meditations and processes that we go through. And then recently, I offered the Mother Mary Love and Empowerment Circle, which is still available on demand, and it's worth listening to because once again, I basically went into an oracle state and received what kinds of processes Mother Mary wanted to take us through that are really calibrated for this time in which there's so much strife, chaos, division, fear, etc. And she was always helping us to get to that more empowered place that was based in love, which is what we are going to need to get us through this crisis over the next few years, especially. So that's available. And I will ongoingly soon be offering a monthly call of that nature, a visit with Mother Mary kind of thing, where we have an experience. And then I do an oracle cosmic Q&A with people responding to their questions just from a more open state of consciousness to see, what's coming through for us today. So that's some of what's in the immediate future, in and around various other programs and things that I'm doing at Seven Sisters Mystery School, which is my school that you referenced at the beginning of our conversation. And people can go to sevensistersmysteryschool.com, and the 7 is written out, SEVEN, and you can find all of that. You can find my on-demand courses, my new what's coming up, many free audios and videos that I have, all the many blog posts that I've offered, how to connect with me to have one-on-one mentoring, because I give, reading to people to assist them on their spiritual deepening of their spiritual path, and also with sacred career and sacred ministry activities that they're interested in. So there are many, many things that are going on. I'm presently at the tail end of enrolling in oracle training, the Priestess of the Dove oracle training, to train women how to open their channel and become these transmitters of divine information, which is really what we all are naturally. I'm just helping sort of, smooth the way for people and put a little oil into it.
Okay, very good. I will include a link to the Seven Sisters Mystery School in the show notes and description on YouTube, and also provide links for your book so that people can access them easily. So,
and Nick, one thing we need to is also the link for the audio version of the book, because
all right.
There was an argument between Audible and Simon and Schuster, and it got pulled from Audible and from Amazon, but it is available in through other channels.
Okay.
And it is worth getting either alone or as a companion to the written book, because I recorded that really with delivering transmissions in mind. And it's just good to hear this material spoken out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So I encourage people really to buy the book in one form or another, or both, because it's very readable, as you saw. My first two books are a bit more academic, but this one is accessible by anyone. I mean, I have heard from people who are not academics at all, who are not intellectuals at all, and they find it rich and deep, but very readable.
It is very readable. It's very accessible. And I appreciated that about the book as well.
Thank you.
So, well, Marguerite, it's been an absolute delight speaking with you today. Thank you again for your time. And,
you're so welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your really profound attention to my book. I know that takes a lot of time on your end, and I really appreciate it so that we can have discussions of this nature. Not all of the interviews I've done have gone so deeply in terms of the academics of it or the textual nature of it. And I think that was important. I think we've woven together some of that material with the esoterics quite nicely.
Yeah, I hope so. That's always one of my goals.
Yeah, I think you've succeeded.
Oh, well, very good. Well, Marguerite, thank you again. I do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And that's a wrap on episode 10 of Rebel Spirit Radio. I have achieved double digits. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Your reviews really do help. And please consider subscribing. For those of you viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be notified whenever I upload new content. For the time being, I'll be releasing episodes every other week with the goal of releasing them every week in the near future. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. If you would like to support my work in creating free and engaging material on YouTube, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find a link in the video description or show notes. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace and flourish in all possible ways.